"I did not hire her for her opinions," Lord Ashworth said, loudly enough that the words reached the doorway, where Georgiana stood with a rolled ledger tucked under one arm and a list of quarterly figures in her hand. She did not flinch. She had been managing crises before breakfast for 4 years, and Lord Ashworth's opinions of her opinions were not, by any measure, the most formidable thing she had faced before noon. The Ashworth drawing room was arranged with the full weight of inherited wealth behind it. 12 candles burned in the central chandelier, though it was midday, and the October light came clean through the long windows. The carpet was turkey red and had cost more than Georgiana's father earned in his final 3 working years. 3 men sat arranged around the fireplace: Ashworth himself, his solicitor Mr. Vane, and the wool merchant Hartley, who had traveled from Bradford and was not, by his expression, pleased about it. A 4th chair sat empty. No one had placed a chair for Georgiana. She set the ledger on the sideboard that no one else was using, opened her list to the 3rd page, and waited to be acknowledged. She had learned not to count on things that merely looked like welcome. The meeting proceeded for 11 minutes without her. Ashworth reported that the Northern Quarter's wool contracts had returned a shortfall of some considerable sum. He was vague about the figure, which was itself instructive, because Georgiana knew the figure precisely. Hartley suggested that the problem lay with the estate's routing arrangements. Vane offered that the matter might benefit from a secondary review. It was at this point that Georgiana, who had not been asked, said, "The shortfall is £412, Mr. Hartley. It does not lie with the routing. It lies with the per-stone rate agreed in the March renewal, which was set 6 shillings below the Bradford standard because the renewal was signed in a week when Lord Ashworth was not in residence and the rate was not cross-referenced against the current quarter's projections." The 3 men looked at her. Lord Ashworth said, in the tone that had preceded her dismissal from 2 previous positions, that he had not hired her for her opinions. Georgiana looked at him steadily. "No," she said. "You hired me to maintain the accounts. The opinion is a consequence of having done so for 14 months. She set the list of quarterly figures on the table in front of Hartley, opened to the relevant page, with the March renewal rate circled in ink she had applied at 6:30 that morning, before anyone else in the house had woken. Hartley read the page. He read it again. He looked at Vane. He looked at Ashworth. He said, in a voice from which much of its earlier certainty had gone, that he supposed they had better discuss the March figure. The shortfall was recovered in full by the end of that quarter. Lord Ashworth never thanked her. He did, however, renew her position for a 2nd year at the same rate, which, in Georgiana's experience of men who employed women to manage things they did not wish to manage themselves, constituted something very near an apology. She picked up her list, made a notation at the bottom of page 3, and returned to the accounts room that had been converted from a disused scullery and given to her as an office. She noted the meeting's outcome. She noted the recovered figure. She noted that the March renewal clause required renegotiation before the following year's contract cycle. Then she continued. It was not victory, precisely. It was something older and quieter than that. It was the particular satisfaction of work done correctly in a world that had arranged itself to make such work very difficult to do. The house in which Georgiana Hartwell had grown up had not been large, but it had been her father's, and her father had run it with the ordered attention of a man who believed that numbers told the truth when people would not. He had taught her double-entry bookkeeping before she turned 12. He had taught her to read a contract the way a surgeon reads a wound, looking for what should be there and is not. He had died when she was 19, of a chest complaint that took him across one winter, and had left behind a house mortgaged to a cousin named Aldrich who had arrived at the funeral wearing new boots, and an expression that Georgiana recognized, even then, as the face of a man calculating what he was about to inherit. She had spent the following 3 years as Aldrich's estate bookkeeper, unpaid, in the house that had been her father's, keeping records for a man who referred to her as his ward and meant his useful furniture. Aldrich was not cruel in any dramatic sense. He did not shout. He was precise in his condescension, which she found, in some ways, harder to manage than rage. He introduced her to guests as his cousin's daughter, which was technically accurate and structurally designed to convey nothing. He assigned her the creditor accounts, the supplier negotiations, the tenant rent collection, and the quarterly reports for his wool interests in the north. He did none of these things himself. He reviewed her work when it was convenient, and signed his name to the conclusions she had reached by other people's labor, and did not say so. She did the work because the work needed doing, and because she was better at it than anyone else available, and because she had decided, in the second month after her father's death, that she was not going to become less than she was, simply because the world had arranged for her to have nothing. There had been a moment, she placed it precisely, a Tuesday in February, the third year, when the frost was on the inside of the accounts room window and the coal allowance had been reduced without notice, when she could have wept herself into a kind of comfortable surrender. She had sat with the ledger open and the coal bucket empty, and understood that no one was coming to observe what she had done, or to tell her it was enough. That moment lasted perhaps 4 minutes. Then she wrapped her coat more tightly, moved the candle closer, and returned to the accounts. She had balanced Aldrich's northern contracts to within a half-shilling discrepancy across 2 consecutive quarters, and had renegotiated the Bradford wool rate at the spring fair without being authorized to do so, on the grounds that the existing rate was wrong and someone had to fix it. Aldrich had reviewed the improved figures and said nothing. He had not, however, corrected the rate back. When Aldrich married, his new wife brought her own bookkeeper, her brother, who had failed at law and required a position, and Georgiana was released from her duties with a letter of reference that described her as thorough and reliable, and did not mention that she had recovered over £900 in mismanaged accounts during her tenure. She had been thorough and reliable for Lord Ashworth for 14 months before the morning of the Hartley meeting. Before that, she had held 2 other positions, one in a solicitor's office in Harrogate, where they had let her go after 6 months on the grounds that clients found a female bookkeeper unsettling, and one in a Derbyshire household, where the housekeeper had been civil and the employer indifferent, and the work adequate but not sufficient to hold her interest. She was 26 years old. She had been managing other people's money for 7 years. She had never once been asked for her opinion, and she had given it anyway when the figures required it, and she had been correct every time she had done so. She had learned, in those years, the particular texture of being overlooked. It was not, as some imagined, like invisibility. It was more precise than that, like being a load-bearing wall in a building everyone admired for its windows. The room stood because of you. No one looked at the wall. The first time she had been seen, truly seen, not just noticed, had been by her father, who had once held up her bookkeeping exercise at the kitchen table, and said, with the quiet certainty of a man who did not waste words, that she had a mind for this, and he was glad of it. She had been 11 years old. She had carried that sentence like a stone in her pocket ever since, not as comfort exactly, but as evidence. Evidence that the thing she knew she was had once been witnessed by someone who was qualified to say so. She had been waiting, with the particular patience of a person who has learned to wait without ceasing to work, for someone else to be so qualified. His Grace the Duke of Merton did not arrive at Lord Ashworth's autumn dinner, as though arriving were something he did. He arrived as though the house had simply acquired him, tall, dark-coated, standing in the doorway of the dining room with the particular quality of absolute self-possession that Georgiana had only ever seen in men who had so much authority that they had long since stopped performing it. She was in the side corridor when he passed through, carrying the corrected seating chart she had redone after Lady Ashworth had changed 3 names that afternoon and forgotten to inform the cook. She was not a guest. She was the woman who had made the dinner possible in the mechanical sense, who had checked the accounts against the caterer's invoice and found a discrepancy of 7 shillings, who had sourced the replacement flower arrangement when the florist's delivery arrived with the wrong roses, who had confirmed the order of precedence for the table because Lord Ashworth's secretary had gotten it wrong and put a baronet above a viscount. The Duke of Merton passed within 4 feet of her. He was accompanied by his secretary, a compact, careful man, and he was speaking in a voice too quiet to carry, which Georgiana noted was deliberate. Men who spoke quietly in social gatherings were either uninterested in being overheard or interested in everything being overheard by specific people only. He did not look at the seating chart she was carrying. He looked, for the space of perhaps 2 seconds, directly at her. Not with admiration, not with confusion, with the particular measuring attention of a man who had just noticed something he had not expected to notice, and was filing it away before moving on. Then he moved on. Georgiana returned to the dining room, corrected the placement cards at the 4th and 6th chairs, confirmed the order of the soup course with the housekeeper, and did not allow herself to think about the way the Duke of Merton had looked at her, as though she were a figure in a column that had come out correctly when it should have come out wrong. She had managed Ashworth's accounts for 14 months. She could manage this. What Georgiana did not know, as she returned to the accounts room that evening and recorded the recovered margin from the Hartley meeting in her quarterly summary, was that the Duke of Merton had arrived at Ashworth's dinner with a specific purpose that had nothing to do with Lord Ashworth. His secretary, a man named Wells who had worked for the Duke for 11 years and understood his employer's methods with the resigned clarity of someone who has learned that precision is not coldness but a kind of loyalty, had delivered a report 3 weeks earlier. The report concerned the management of Ashworth's northern accounts, which had come to the Duke's attention through a mutual contact in Bradford, a wool merchant who had mentioned, in passing, that Ashworth's contracts had improved substantially in the past year, despite Ashworth himself appearing to understand nothing about them. Frederick Alcott, 9th Duke of Merton, was 34 years old and had been managing a dukedom of 4 estates, 2 London properties, 11 farms, and a wool and textile interest that employed 400 people for 6 years, since his father's death. He did so without apparent effort, which misled people who did not understand that what looked like ease was actually the product of rigorous systems and the ruthless elimination of incompetence. He had a wound that he did not discuss. His mother had died when he was 8, of a fever that had taken her in less than a fortnight, and the estate at Merton Park had been the place from which he had watched that happen, without the language or the power to prevent it. The park still felt, in certain lights, like a held breath. He had returned to full residency 6 years ago, when the dukedom fell to him, and had since governed it with the kind of attention you give to things you have nearly lost. He had no wife. This was a source of considerable comment in the circles that concerned themselves with such things. There was, in particular, Lady Serena Fairfax, daughter of the Earl of Culverton, educated, composed, connected, and entirely prepared to become a duchess, who had been positioned in his social orbit for 3 seasons by a family that understood the machinery of aristocratic marriage, with the same clarity Georgiana understood accounts. Lady Serena was beautiful and appropriate, and Frederick had observed her at approximately 14 social engagements, and felt, each time, the precise sensation of a door that fits its frame too well, correct, seamless, and admitting no air. He had not sought a wife because none of the candidates had seemed necessary. This was not a romantic criterion. It was a practical one. Frederick had discovered, over his years of managing the dukedom, that the only things worth having were the ones that made the work better rather than more complicated. He had not found a person who made the work better. Wells's report on Ashworth's northern accounts had mentioned, near the bottom of the 3rd page, that the improved management appeared to originate with a female bookkeeper employed by Ashworth in an unofficial capacity, officially listed as a household secretary, which was the polite fiction that permitted Ashworth to pay her at 2/3 the rate a male equivalent would have commanded. The report noted that the Bradford rate renegotiation had been her initiative, unauthorized and correct. It noted that she had identified and recovered a routing discrepancy that Ashworth's solicitor had missed. It noted that she had done all of this from a converted scullery that served as her office. Frederick had read the report once, set it aside, and read it again. Then he had attended Ashworth's dinner. He had not gone expecting a great deal. Women of demonstrated ability were not, in his experience, unusual. He had employed a housekeeper at Merton Park for 9 years, who ran the household with a systematic precision he respected entirely. What was unusual was the degree to which this particular ability had been operating without any infrastructure, any recognition, or any authority. What he saw in the corridor had confirmed the report and exceeded it. She was carrying a seating chart at 7:30 in the evening of a formal dinner, which meant she had been working since the morning at minimum, and the way she held it, not as a temporary task but as a document she was responsible for, told him something about the quality of her attention that no report could have conveyed. He attended the dinner. He sat through 4 courses of Lord Ashworth discussing the northern wool market with the relaxed authority of a man who had not personally understood a contract clause in 14 months. He listened to Lady Serena Fairfax, seated 3 places to his left, conduct a conversation about the summer season, with the effortless social fluency of a woman who had been trained for exactly this surface. He was polite to everyone. He ate little. After the dinner, he found Wells and told him to arrange a meeting with Ashworth for the following week. The purpose of the meeting was to be described as the Duke's general interest in expanding his northern textile interests. This was true. It was also secondary. Wells, who knew his employer thoroughly, wrote the letter that evening and did not ask for clarification. He had learned, over 11 years, that when the Duke attended a social engagement and came away with something to do, the thing to do was generally more important than it appeared. 3 weeks later, Georgiana was summoned to Lord Ashworth's study to present the northern accounts to his new associate. She had spent the previous evening reviewing everything she had compiled in 14 months, not because she needed the review, she knew every figure, but because the presentation of organized information was itself a form of argument, and she intended to argue clearly. She arrived at the study door at the appointed hour, carrying the quarterly summaries bound in order, the original Bradford contract with her annotations in the margin, and the renegotiated rate schedule she had produced the previous spring. She had worn her gray dress, which was the most professional garment she owned, and which she had worn to every formal presentation she had given in 4 years. It was not fashionable, it was correct. When she entered and found that Lord Ashworth's new associate was the Duke of Merton, she made one small involuntary adjustment to her posture, a slight straightening of her spine, and then she continued to the table and set down the documents in the order she had planned. Lord Ashworth made an introduction that described her as his secretary, and did not mention that she had renegotiated his wool contracts. She did not correct this. She noted it. Frederick stood as she entered, which was not required of him. He said, "Miss Hartwell, I understand the quarterly margin recovery on the northern accounts was approximately £412. I wonder if you would walk me through the methodology." Lord Ashworth blinked. He had not, in 14 months, asked her to walk him through the methodology. Georgiana opened the annotated contract to the relevant page and began. She spoke for 22 minutes. She did not rush. She explained the Bradford rate discrepancy, the mechanism by which it had compounded over 3 quarters, the clause in the March renewal that had created the exposure, and the specific renegotiation terms she had proposed and secured at the spring fair. She explained the cross-referencing system she had built to prevent a recurrence. She noted the 2 additional areas in the accounts where similar discrepancies existed and had not yet been corrected. Frederick asked 6 questions. 3 of them identified the precise points she had anticipated being questioned on. 2 of them extended the analysis to implications she had considered and could answer. One of them, concerning the potential application of the cross-referencing system to a multi-estate operation, she had not expected, and she paused for a moment before answering, because the question was more interesting than the ones that had preceded it, and she wanted to answer it correctly. "It would require modification," she said. "The system as it stands assumes a single set of supplier relationships. Across multiple estates, you would need a tiered structure, a master rate schedule held centrally, with site-specific adjustments tracked against it. I have not designed such a system, but the architecture is not complicated. 3 to 4 weeks of initial setup, assuming access to the relevant contracts." Frederick looked at her for a moment, with the same expression he had worn in the corridor at the dinner. Measuring, precise, not unkind. 3 to 4 weeks, he said. "Perhaps less," she said, "if the contracts are well organized." He did not smile. He did make a small, specific motion, a slight inclination of his head, that she read as the acknowledgement of a person who has heard a thing they consider accurate, and does not require it to be repeated. Lord Ashworth, who had understood approximately a third of the preceding 22 minutes, suggested that they take tea. It was not a comfortable household, Merton Park. It was a correct household, which was a different thing entirely. The rooms were arranged with the precision of a man who disliked unnecessary objects, and cleaned with a thoroughness that suggested the staff had understood the value placed on order without being told explicitly. The library was exceptional, not in size but in organization, and Georgiana, who was shown through it on her second day in residence, as part of the housekeeper's orientation tour, recognized the system immediately, as one she had seen described in a treatise on estate management she had read at her father's desk when she was 16. She had accepted the Duke's offer after a pause that lasted the better part of an afternoon. He had made it in Ashworth's study, in Ashworth's presence, which had required Ashworth to sit through the experience of watching his secretary offered a senior position in a ducal household at a salary that was, to Georgiana's careful calculation, 3.5 times what Ashworth paid her. She had looked at the offer. She had looked at the contract Wells had produced, which was a single page and written with the clarity of a document that expected to be read carefully. She had read it carefully. She had found nothing in it that required negotiation, except one clause concerning the notice period, which she amended in the margin from 14 days to 30, with a brief annotation explaining her reasoning. Frederick had read the amendment. He had said, "Agreed," and signed it. She had thought about it until the following morning, and then said yes. The offer had not been made with warmth. It had been made with the kind of specificity that she had come to understand. Over 4 years of being managed by men who used warmth as a substitute for precision was its own form of respect. He had said, in the study with Ashworth fidgeting in his chair, that the Merton estate accounts required systematic reform, that the current method of management produced consistent but recoverable losses, that he had reviewed her work and found it correct, and that he was offering her the position of estate accounts manager, not secretary, not household bookkeeper, at the stated salary with the stated terms. He had not said he thought highly of her, or that she showed great promise, or that he was certain she would do very well. These were the things men said when they meant to be kind without being honest. He had said her work was correct, which was the only thing she had ever wanted anyone to say. She thought, going to sleep in the Ashworth guest room the night before she gave her answer, of her father holding up her bookkeeping exercise at the kitchen table. She thought of the 4 years between that moment and this one. She thought of the converted scullery, and the 14 months, and the £412. Then she slept, and in the morning she said yes. Mrs. Dent, the Merton Park housekeeper, was a compact woman of 50-odd years, with the particular quality of a person who has been doing important work for so long that the work had settled into her bearing. She met Georgiana at the servants' entrance on the first morning, not the main entrance, which would have been inappropriate for her position, but not without ceremony either. She showed her to the accounts room, which was a real accounts room, with proper shelving and adequate light from 2 windows, and a desk that had been built for the purpose rather than converted from something else. She said, "The previous accounts man left the northern contracts in a state. His Grace has left a note that you are to have full access to everything." "Everything," Georgiana said. "Without exception." Mrs. Dent looked at her with the particular directness of a woman who decides quickly. "There's tea at 7:30. The cook does a proper breakfast. I've told Millicent, that's the second housemaid, that you're to be treated as staff of position. If anyone gives you difficulty, I'm the person to tell." It was the most comprehensive welcome Georgiana had received in 4 years of employment. She did not make a great deal of it in the moment. She made a note of it in the column she kept, not in the accounts, but somewhere more private, where she recorded the things that mattered. The accounts were, as Mrs. Dent had suggested, a considerable undertaking. The previous accounts man, a Mr. Fowles, who had retired on grounds of age, had been competent in the way that many men are competent. Adequate in a stable system, entirely unequipped for when the system changed. He had maintained records for 9 years in a format that predated the current contract structure by 6 years and had never been updated. The resulting gap between what the ledgers claimed and what the estate had actually paid and received was not, on first examination, alarming. On second examination, it was substantial. Georgiana spent the first 2 weeks doing nothing but reading. She read every contract. She read every supplier agreement. She read the tenant rent rolls going back to the beginning of Fowles's tenure. She cross-referenced the quarterly summaries against the individual transaction records, and found, On the 14th day, a discrepancy in the estate's timber account that had been producing a slow annual loss for 8 years and had gone unnoticed because it fell below the threshold that Fowles had apparently set for individual review. 8 years. She sat with the figure for a moment and let it settle, the way she always let a discovered error settle before moving on. Not with anger, because anger was not useful, but with the particular attention of someone cataloging the true dimensions of a problem before solving it. The cumulative loss was £940. She wrote up her findings in a 3-page summary, with the supporting calculations attached, carried it to the estate office, where Frederick received reports between 8 and 9 in the morning, and left it in the tray marked for his review. The following morning, at 7 minutes past 8, she heard a knock at the accounts room door. "Come in," she said, though she had not expected anyone. Staff knocked before entering, but rarely did at that hour. Frederick Alcott, 9th Duke of Merton, came in, which was not standard. He was carrying her 3-page summary. He was also, she noticed, in his shirt sleeves, his tailcoat apparently having been left in the estate office, which was the first time she had seen him without the full formal arrangement of his authority, and which produced in her a sensation she catalogued, with the same precision she brought to everything, as the recognition that he was, underneath the dukedom, a person who worked. "The timber account," he said. "Yes," she said. 8 years, £940, cumulative. He set the summary on the desk beside her and pointed to the 3rd page. "You've flagged 4 other accounts for the same class of error." "I have. I haven't completed the review on those yet. I expect they are cleaner, but I wanted to bring the timber account to you as soon as I was certain of the figures." He stood at the edge of her desk and looked at the summary in a way that she had come to recognize, in the 3 weeks she had been at Merton Park, as his method of reading, not line by line but in a kind of structural assessment, as though he were reading the architecture of the document rather than only its content. "The previous accounts man," he said. "He was not equipped for the current contract structure," she said, because it was accurate, and because she would not say anything more dismissive than that about a man who had simply been in a position that had outgrown him. Frederick looked at her. "No," he said, "he was not." He picked up the summary. "I'll want a full review of all 4 accounts within the month." 2 weeks, she said. He looked at her with the measuring attention again, the same one from the corridor at Ashworth's dinner, and she held it steadily because she had said 2 weeks because 2 weeks was accurate, and she was not going to revise it to seem modest. 2 weeks, he agreed, and left. She picked up her pen and returned to the next contract in the stack. 29 days into her residency at Merton Park, she was informed by Wells, in the manner of a man delivering information he considered relevant to her operational effectiveness, that the Duke's annual estate review dinner was in 3 weeks, and that Lord Culverton and his daughter would be among the guests. She noted this. It was not her concern professionally. It did, however, explain certain things she had observed, including the twice-weekly letters that arrived from London in a handwriting that she had catalogued, without permitting herself to examine the cataloguing too closely, as probably Lady Serena Fairfax's. She had seen the expected woman once, at a county gathering in the 3rd week of her residency, when Frederick had attended briefly, and she had gone to hand him a corrected purchase order from the estate's East Farm supplier. Lady Serena had been standing at Frederick's left, in an ivory dress that had been chosen with the kind of precision that makes dressing look like the natural state of a person. She was 22, and composed and thoroughly prepared for the life she was moving toward, and Georgiana found her not unlikable, the way she found well-built machinery not unlikable, with a certain professional appreciation for its construction. Lady Serena had looked at Georgiana with the expression of someone who has understood instantly what she was looking at, and has decided the question does not require further examination. The look was not cruel, it was conclusive. Georgiana had handed Frederick the corrected purchase order, said that the East Farm account required his signature before Friday, and returned to the accounts room. She had managed the Ashworth household for 14 months, and the Merton accounts for 3 weeks. She could manage an estate review dinner. What she had not accounted for, in her management of things, was Lord Culverton. The Earl of Culverton was a man of 63 who had acquired his opinions over a long career in which they had mostly been correct, and who had consequently never developed the habit of questioning them. He arrived at Merton Park for the estate review dinner with the assurance of a man who considers himself a permanent part of the landscape, and he moved through the house with the particular quality of someone who has already decided how events will proceed. He encountered Georgiana in the East Corridor at 4:20 as she was carrying the final seating arrangement to the dining room. "You," he said, as though he were addressing a piece of furniture that had moved without authorization. "You are the accounts woman." "I am the estate accounts manager," she said. "Yes, my lord." He studied her with an attention that was the opposite of Frederick's. Where Frederick's measuring gaze was looking for what was there, Culverton's was looking for confirmation of what he had already decided was absent. "Ashworth's girl," he said. "I'd heard about you." "I expect you have," she said, because this was true, and because she was not going to pretend otherwise. "What Ashworth chooses to do with his household staff is his own concern," Culverton said, with the precise inflection of a man who considers the business of other households very much his own concern when it affects his designs. "Merton is another matter. The management of a ducal estate requires—" "My lord," she said, because she had the seating arrangement in her hands, and the dinner was in 2 hours, and she had already corrected his placement card twice. "The annual accounts review is at 10 o'clock tomorrow morning. I will present the year's findings and projections then. If you have concerns about the estate's management after that presentation, I would welcome them." Culverton looked at her with the expression of a man who is not accustomed to being directed toward the appropriate forum. She met his gaze without difficulty. She had 4 years of practice in meeting the gaze of men who considered her presence a disruption of something structural. She found it, at this point, more fatiguing than frightening. He said, "I shall attend the review." "Yes," she said. "I know." She had set his name in the attendee list herself. She went to the dining room, placed the seating arrangement with the relevant cards, confirmed the order of courses with the cook, and returned to the accounts room to prepare the morning's presentation. That evening, after the dinner had concluded and the guests had retired, she was still at her desk at 10:30, cross-referencing the East Farm figures against the corrected purchase order, when she heard footsteps in the corridor outside the accounts room. They stopped at her door. There was a pause, not the brief pause of someone who has checked a door in passing, but a considered one, the pause of someone who has stopped deliberately. She waited. The footsteps moved on, slow and unhurried. She looked at the closed door for a moment, with the particular stillness of a person who has just had an experience they have not yet fully interpreted. Then she returned to the East Farm figures. She found, the following morning, that the corridor outside the accounts room had a clean lamp installed in the wall bracket that had previously been dark. She had not requested this. She noted it in the private column. 3 nights in a row, during the week of the estate review preparations, the footsteps stopped outside her door. On the 4th night, she was still at the desk, and the door was open by 3 inches, because the room became warm in the late evening. She heard the footsteps stop. She heard, after a pause, a quiet sound that was not quite a sigh, and not quite a breath, but contained something of both. The sound of a person who is standing outside a room in which someone is working, and is finding this, for reasons they have not named, sufficient. She did not call out. She continued with the accounts. But she pressed one hand briefly against the edge of the desk, because the thing in her chest had a weight she had not expected, and she wanted to be certain of something solid. On the 5th morning, Frederick appeared at the accounts room door at 7:30, which was earlier than his usual 8 o'clock, with 2 cups of tea. He set one on the corner of her desk without explanation. He sat in the chair against the wall, not her desk chair, the secondary chair, the one visitors used, and said, "The East Farm projection shows a 14% improvement over the previous year, if the new rotation schedule holds," she said. "I've modeled it conservatively. The actual figure may be better." He drank his tea, she drank hers. They worked in the same room for 40 minutes without anything requiring comment, and it was the most natural 40 minutes she had spent in 4 years of employment. When he rose to leave, he paused at the door and said, without turning, the lamp in the corridor. Yes, she said. It should have been there before. It should, she agreed. He left. She picked up her pen and continued with the East Farm projection. Her hand was entirely steady. The thing in her chest, however, had settled into something that felt less like weight and more like warmth, and she made no entry about it in the accounts, because some figures did not belong there. She had been wrong about one thing in her preparation for the annual accounts review. She had estimated Lord Culverton's intervention as a late-session complication. He produced it at the 12-minute mark. The review took place in the Merton Park estate office, which had been arranged for the purpose with a long table, 6 chairs, and a writing board on the east wall where she had pinned the key charts the previous evening. Present were Frederick, Lord Culverton, Wells, the estate steward Mr. Calloway, a Bradford wool merchant named Sims who represented the northern textile interests, and, at the end of the table, a woman Georgiana had not previously met, Miss Charlotte Pierce, who was the daughter of a neighboring estate owner and who had apparently attended at Frederick's specific invitation for reasons that were not, initially, explained. Georgiana stood at the writing board and began. She was 11 minutes into the presentation. She had covered the timber account recovery, the corrected contract structure, and the cross-referencing system, when Culverton interrupted. He did it with the smooth authority of a man who has long practice in redirecting proceedings. Miss Hartwell, he said, these are the findings of 8 months' work. 14 months, she said. 14 months between the Ashworth accounts and the work at Merton Park. The system is mine. The figures are the estate's. A system devised by someone without formal training in estate management, he said. She looked at him with the patient precision of someone who has been waiting for this particular argument and has prepared for it carefully. My training was practical, she said. I would be interested to know, my lord, whether you consider practical success or formal credential the appropriate measure. A ducal estate, Culverton said, with the tone of a man who believes the weight of the noun should end the discussion, requires management in keeping with. The East Farm has shown a 14% improvement, she said. The timber account discrepancy, £940 over 8 years, has been identified and is being recovered. The northern contract structure has been rebuilt. I have those figures here. She moved to the table and placed 3 pages in front of him. The summary, the supporting calculations, and the projection schedule. She placed them without force and without ceremony. The estate does not require my credentials, she said. It requires the work. The work has been done. Culverton looked at the pages. He looked at them as a man looks at something he had not expected to be organized and was not fully prepared for. Sims, the Bradford merchant, cleared his throat. The northern contract improvement is real, he said. I can confirm it from our end. The rate renegotiation alone. £412 in the first year, Georgiana said. I have the original rate and the corrected rate, documented on page 2. Sims found page 2. He nodded. It was at this point that Miss Charlotte Pierce, who had not yet spoken, said in a voice that was direct and entirely unadorned with social qualification, "She has it in writing. All of it. Every figure." She looked at Culverton with the frank expression of someone who considers the argument already settled. I have looked at the accounts this morning. They are the clearest I have seen in 12 years of attending my father's estate reviews, and his man has a formal credential from Edinburgh. Culverton looked at Charlotte Pierce. He looked at the pages. He looked, finally, at Frederick, who had been sitting at the head of the table throughout this exchange, with the contained quality of a man who has decided exactly what he intends to do, and is waiting for the appropriate moment to do it. Frederick said, Lord Culverton, the accounts are correct, the system is sound, the estate is in better condition than it has been in 8 years. He paused. This is the conclusion of the review. Culverton said, the question of suitability for is not under review today, Frederick said. The room settled. Sims made a notation in his book. Calloway studied the writing board with the attentive expression of a man, very carefully not looking at Lord Culverton. Charlotte Pierce looked at Georgiana with the satisfied expression of someone who has watched a well-built structure demonstrate its load. Georgiana turned back to the writing board. She finished the presentation. She covered the remaining 3 points. the proposed contract modifications for the following year, the updated tenant role projections, and the new cross-referencing system she would deliver in complete form within the week. She spoke for 18 more minutes. When she concluded, Wells began to gather the distributed pages. Charlotte Pierce touched Georgiana's arm briefly as she passed, a specific, warm pressure that required no explanation. Sims shook her hand before leaving, which was not standard, and seemed mildly surprised at himself for doing it. Culverton had not moved from his chair. He was still looking at page 2 of the summary, the original rate against the corrected rate, with an expression she could not fully read. When the room was nearly empty, he said, without looking up, "Your father taught you this." It was not a question, but she answered it. Yes. He was quiet for a moment. He said, "He was in trade?" "He was a merchant's bookkeeper," she said. "He was very good at it." Culverton set the page down on the table. He stood. He said, in a voice that had lost some of its earlier architecture, "The East Farm projection. You said conservative." "I did. You believe the actual figure will be better." "I think it is likely," she said, "if the rotation schedule holds." He nodded, once, with the compressed, reluctant acknowledgement of a man who has found a thing more correct than expected and has not yet decided what to do with the information. He left without further comment. It was not conversion. It was not warmth. It was the partial, private recognition of a person who has looked at the evidence and found it, against his original expectations, sufficient. She would take it. The ballroom at Merton Park had not been used for 3 years, which Frederick had mentioned once, in passing, as a fact with no emotional content. Georgiana had noted the way he had mentioned it, the particular flatness of a voice delivering information it has learned to deliver without inflection, and had placed it in the private column beside the footsteps and the lamp and the tea. She had found, in the back of the estate accounts file, a music inventory from the year his mother had died. It listed the pieces she had played, the piano in the East drawing room, maintained at her instruction, tuned 4 times annually. The inventory included a composition in her handwriting, without a title, 8 bars of notation in a hand that was clearly not a professional musician's, but was precise and careful, the hand of someone who had made something for the pleasure of making it. She had not said anything about this to Frederick. On the evening before the winter gathering, a moderate social occasion at the house to which the county's various landholders had been invited, and which was not large enough to require the ballroom, but had prompted its reopening for the season, she sat at the East drawing room piano and played the composition through twice to learn it. It took her 20 minutes. It was a simple piece, not sophisticated, but it had been written by a person who understood what they wanted to hear, and it carried that intention in every phrase. She played it a 3rd time, slowly, in the empty room. The door was open. She did not hear him in the doorway until the final phrase. She did not stop. She played the last bar, and let the notes resolve completely, and then she sat with her hands in her lap and waited. "Where did you find that?" he said from the doorway. "The music inventory," she said. "In the estate files, 1804. He was silent for a moment. She turned on the bench to face him, and he was standing in the doorway with his coat still on from the afternoon's ride, not having stopped to change, which told her something. "She played it at Christmas," he said. "I have not heard it since. I can stop, if you prefer." "No," he said. He came into the room, not to the piano but to the chair beside the window, where he sat with the quality of a person who has been standing at a height for a long time, and has found, unexpectedly, a place to be level. "Play it again." She played it again. He sat in the chair and listened with the particular stillness of a person receiving something they had not known they needed, and when it was done, he said nothing for a considerable time. The fire was low. The room had the settled quality of a late evening in late autumn, when the dark comes early and the house holds its warmth against it. She said, "It is a good estate." "Yes," he said. "Your mother managed it before your father inherited fully. The early records show her hand in the supplier negotiations." She understood the contracts. He looked at her with an expression she had not seen on his face before. Not the measuring attention, not the contained authority, but something quieter, less constructed, the face of a man who has been seen with more precision than he expected. "She did," he said. I noticed, she said. She straightened the music on the stand, which did not require straightening. She was aware of the room and the fire, and the distance between the bench and the chair, which was approximately 8 feet, and felt, in the particular suspended quality of that moment, like a measurement of something other than space. She said, Your cravat has been crooked since before dinner, the left side. He put his hand to his cravat. She stood and crossed to him and straightened it with 2 adjustments, her fingers precise and quick, not lingering. She stepped back. It has been crooked for approximately 40 minutes, she said. He looked up at her from the chair, with the expression of a man who has just had something made clear that he had been trying to understand for some time. He said, quietly, Georgiana. It was the first time he had used her given name. She held it in the way she held figures that came out correctly, with the still satisfaction of a thing confirmed. She returned to the bench. She played the final phrase of the composition one more time, let it resolve, and then closed the music stand gently and left the room. She pressed one hand briefly against the wall in the corridor outside. The winter gathering was held on a Thursday evening. 41 people attended. The rooms were warm and well lit, and the occasion had the quality of a house that has opened its doors with some genuine intention behind the gesture. Georgiana was present as part of the household in her professional capacity, not as a guest, which was correct, and not entirely as staff, which was also correct. She wore the gray dress. She was standing near the library door at 20 minutes past 8, with a corrected supplier figure she needed to give Wells before the end of the evening, when Lord Culverton appeared at her elbow. He said, without preamble, I spoke to Sims this week, the Bradford rate. Yes, she said. He confirmed your figure against his own records. He paused. He looked at her with the considered expression of a man delivering a thing he has been circling for some time. The work you have done here, he said, is not the work of a household secretary. No, she said, it is not. He was quiet for another moment. My concern, he said, was structural, the precedent. I understand, she said, because she did, not with agreement, but with the clear recognition of a system as it actually operated. The precedent, he said again, and then stopped. He looked at her. He said, with the compressed reluctance of a man acknowledging a thing that has cost him something to see, may have been the wrong concern. He walked back into the gathering. It was not an apology. It was the considered admission of a man who has revised one figure in a long calculation he is not yet prepared to redo entirely. She noted it. It was more than she had expected. She was still standing near the library door when Frederick appeared beside her, which was not where she had expected him to be. He had been, for the previous hour, attending to his guests in the central drawing room. He stood at her left, close enough to speak quietly, and said, Wells can take the supplier figure. I know, she said. Neither of them moved. He said very quietly, the East drawing room, tomorrow evening, if you are willing. She understood what he was asking. She said, yes. 23 days after the winter gathering, Frederick proposed to her in the main hall in front of Wells. Mrs. Dent, Charlotte Pierce, who had been invited to stay for the week, and Lord Culverton, who had not left the estate for reasons that had been attributed to road conditions, and that Georgiana believed were somewhat more complicated. He did not make a speech. He offered her his hand, and said that he was asking her to become the Duchess of Merton, that the question was genuine, and that he would wait for her answer. She held the question for a moment, the way she held all important figures, not from uncertainty, but from the discipline of being certain before she committed. She said, I will need to think about it until tomorrow. Charlotte Pierce made a sound that was not quite a laugh. Wells looked at the ceiling. Mrs. Dent had the expression of a woman confirming an opinion she had formed 3 months earlier. Frederick said, with the quiet certainty of a man who has made a decision and is not troubled by patience, tomorrow then. The following morning, she came to the estate office at 5 minutes to 8, before the normal hour, and sat in the secondary chair beside his desk. He looked up from the letter he was reading. She said, yes. He set the letter down. He crossed to where she was sitting. He did not speak for a moment, and when he did, his voice had the particular quality of truth, delivered without ornament, not because it is convenient or appropriate, or fitted the requirements my position imposes. Because you make the work better, because I have learned, in these months, that I cannot imagine the accounts room without a lamp in the corridor, because you played my mother's composition and told me the cravat was crooked, and I understood, at approximately the same moment, both things. He paused. Because you are the first person in my adult life who has given me an accurate answer to every question I have asked. She looked at him with the particular stillness of a person who has waited a long time to be seen with precision, and has now been seen. She said, "The lamp was a good decision." He took her hand. He kissed it, her bare hand, unhurried, specific, not a gesture performed for an audience, but the deliberate act of a person establishing something that is going to last. She felt the warmth of it settle into her, with the quality of a thing correctly placed. They were married in February. The ceremony was small by ducal standards, 30 people, the chapel at Merton Park, a morning in pale winter light that came through the east window and fell across the stone floor, in a pattern she would remember for the rest of her life. Charlotte Pierce stood beside her. Wells stood for the Duke. Mrs. Dent wept in the back row, in the manner of a woman who considers this a personal vindication. Lord Culverton attended. He did not smile. He shook Frederick's hand with the expression of a man who has made his peace with a calculation he originally got wrong, and is not going to belabor the revision. Lady Serena Fairfax had been, by the time of the wedding announcement, engaged to a viscount of good standing and unimpeachable credentials who was, by all accounts, very well suited to her. Georgiana wished her no ill. The system that had produced both of them, the one that had arranged Lady Serena as the expected answer, and Georgiana as the invisible alternative, was the thing she intended, in a quiet and systematic way, to make slightly harder to operate. She began immediately after the wedding. The cross-referencing system she had built for Merton Park's accounts was adapted, in the first year, into a written guide. 41 pages, with examples drawn from real estate figures, and a set of margin annotations, explaining the reasoning behind each step. She sent copies to 7 neighboring estate managers with a letter from the Duke of Merton's household endorsing its use. 3 of them wrote back, 2 adopted it, 1 adopted it and found, in the process, a discrepancy in his own accounts that he had not known was there. She was 30 years old by then, and the mother of a son named Edmund who had arrived in the autumn of the second year, red-faced and loud, and entirely certain of his own importance in a way that Frederick said, with quiet warmth, she would recognize. Edmund had his father's dark eyes and her father's hands, long-fingered, precise, always reaching for things that interested him. He secured the Merton succession in the eyes of every person who had been watching, and Georgiana noted this fact in the accounts with the same specificity she applied to everything, and moved on. 3 years after Edmund's birth, their daughter Clara arrived in the spring, and was named for Georgiana's mother, and had Frederick's reserve and Georgiana's tendency to make notes on everything within reach. She had learned her letters by 4, and was found, on a Tuesday morning when she was 5, sitting at the accounts room desk, with a pen and a blank ledger page making careful marks that she informed her father, with complete seriousness, were the accounts. Frederick had stood in the doorway with the expression Georgiana had first seen in the corridor at Lord Ashworth's dinner, the measuring attention, the particular note of something unexpected, and then he had come to find her in the east drawing room, where she was reviewing the quarterly summary for the northern contracts. He said, "Your daughter is doing the accounts." "I know," she said. "I gave her the blank ledger." He sat in the chair beside the window, his chair now, the one he had sat in on the evening she had played his mother's composition, and looked at her with the quiet particular warmth of a man watching a life he has built, with someone who was always, in every essential way, equal to the building of it. She continued with the northern contracts. She was aware of him watching. She had always been aware of him watching, and she found it, still, after 4 years of marriage and 2 children, and the full weight of the estate, and the 41 pages, and the recovered £940, and the 412 before that, the most accurate form of attention she had ever been given. Outside the window, Edmund was in the garden with Mrs. Dent, who was showing him something in the flower bed with the patience of a woman who has decided, at this stage of her life, that small people with questions deserve answers. Clara's pen scratched steadily in the accounts room next door. Frederick said, without looking away from her, "The lamp in the corridor needs replacing." "I noticed," she said. "I put it on the list." She made the notation at the bottom of the quarterly summary, "Lamp, East Corridor, this week," and continued. The fire was low, the room was warm, the house stood around them, correct and solid, a thing that had been built by people who understood what they were building, and she was at its center, and she knew it, and so did he.